The year was 1888, a time when men still believed they could conquer the wild with heavy purses and arrogant architecture. It was the eve of what history would remember as the Great White Hurricane, a monstrous cyclonic bomb that descended upon the Dakota Territory with a fury that froze the breath in men's lungs before it could leave their lips. Above ground, the world was ending. A chaotic, howling white inferno tore across the plains at 70 miles per hour, dropping the temperature to a deadly 40 degrees below zero. In the opulent, towering Victorian mansions of the town's elite, men who had built their fortunes on the backs of others, panic had taken root. The wealthy merchants, the haughty engineers, and the proud politicians were discovering a terrifying truth. Paper money does not burn hot enough to stop a blizzard. Their grand homes, built of thin, imported pine and vast panes of elegant glass, were completely defenseless against the wrath of the sky. The sheer force of the wind was driving microscopic ice crystals through the keyholes, under the grand oak doors, and through the microscopic gaps in the expensive floorboards. Inside a lavish parlor, a $300 imported cast-iron coal boiler, a marvel of modern engineering, they had boasted, roared uselessly. It devoured mountains of black coal, yet the heat was instantly stripped away by the freezing drafts, sucked out through the uninsulated walls faster than the iron could radiate it. The elites huddled in their expensive furs, watching in shivering horror as the water in their crystal glasses froze solid right on the dining tables. They were trapped in beautiful, freezing wooden boxes, their gold utterly worthless against the judgment of nature. But 40 feet below the crest of a silent, snow-covered hill, just a mile away from the freezing town, a very different reality existed. Here, the roaring shrieks of the cyclonic bomb were reduced to a faint, distant whisper, muffled by millions of pounds of ancient, insulating soil. Down here, in a small space carved directly into the breast of the earth, there was no panic. There was no freezing wind. There was only a profound, womb-like peace, and the steady, comforting glow of a tiny twig fire. Inside this subterranean sanctuary, a 16-year-old girl named Alara sat cross-legged on a floor of hard-packed clay. Her clothes were humble, worn at the elbows, yet her posture was calm, her breathing slow and measured. Next to her, wrapped in a single, well-mended wool blanket, her 5-year-old brother, Leo, was fast asleep. His cheeks were flushed with a healthy, rosy warmth. A delicate bead of sweat rested on his brow. While the town's wealthy engineers froze beside their $300 mechanical beasts, Alara's shelter maintained a perfectly stable, unwavering temperature of 64 degrees Fahrenheit. She had not achieved this through wealth, nor through the complicated machinery that the town's educated men worshipped. She had achieved this with a rusted shovel, a few discarded iron nails, a scrap of old stovepipe, and exactly $10. She had built a dirt hole, a dugout, a structure the elite had mocked as a shallow grave. Yet, as the freezing death marched across the surface, this $10 dirt hole was not a grave at all. It was the safest, warmest place for 100 miles. The earth itself, massive, dense, and unyielding, was holding them in its warm embrace. The thermal mass of the thick clay walls had absorbed the gentle heat of Alara's meager fire for weeks, storing it deep within the soil, and was now radiating it back into the small room with unwavering loyalty. It was an ancient, silent physics. It was the wisdom of those who know they must cooperate with nature rather than arrogantly attempt to conquer it. How did a 16-year-old girl, carrying a child, come to be living inside the earth while the town's wealthiest men froze in their mansions? To understand this triumph of humility over arrogance, we must turn back the clock to the dying days of autumn, when the air first turned brittle and the leaves began to rot on the freezing ground. Ilara and Leo had not chosen to live in the dirt out of a romantic desire for isolation. They had been forced into it by the purest form of human cruelty. Their mother, a gentlewoman who had known too much sorrow, had passed away from a lingering fever just as the first frosts hardened the mud. She had left behind her 2 children in the supposed care of her second husband, Silas. Silas was a man whose soul was as cold and sharp as a silver coin. He was the town's most prosperous merchant, a man who had recently finished constructing the largest, most ostentatious wooden house in the valley. Silas despised weakness, and he despised the financial burden of a teenage stepdaughter and a small boy who shared none of his blood. The day after their mother was lowered into the frozen cemetery, Silas locked the heavy oak doors of his great house. Ilara stood on the grand porch, holding little Leo's hand, shivering in the autumn wind. Silas stepped out, wearing a heavy, expensive wool coat. He did not look at the children with pity. He looked at them as a ledger entry he was finally crossing out. With a sneer of contempt, he tossed a single, crumpled $10 bill onto the frosted porch at Ilara's feet. He told her she was a drain on his resources. He told her that at 16, she was old enough to find her own way in the world, and that the boy was her problem now. When Ilara pleaded, not for herself, but for her little brother, pointing to the gray, threatening clouds gathering on the northern horizon, Silas merely laughed. He gestured to his towering, thin-walled mansion and his brand-new, $300 coal heating system. He boasted that winter was only a threat to the poor and the stupid. With a final, dismissive wave, he ordered them off his property, banishing them into the unforgiving wild with nothing but the clothes on their backs and $10 to their name. They were cast out, discarded by a society that measured a person's right to live by the weight of their pockets. The town's elite watched from their warm windows as the teenage girl and the little boy walked away toward the barren hills, and not a single door opened for them. But Silas and the arrogant men of the town had made a fatal miscalculation. They had confused wealth with survival. They had forgotten the ancient laws of the earth, and as the great winter prepared to unleash its absolute fury, the earth was getting ready to teach them a lesson they would never, ever forget. Before we walk alongside Ilara into the freezing mud to witness how she turned $10 of scrap into an unbreakable fortress of warmth, I ask you to pause. If you believe that ancient wisdom and true humility will always outlast the fragile arrogance of modern elites, please subscribe to this channel. Leave a like to support these stories of survival and justice, and share this video with those who still value the old ways. Tell me in the comments, from which city are you listening to this journey today? Your presence here keeps the fire of this legacy burning. Now, let us return to the cold wind and see how a banished girl began to dig her salvation. The wind that sweeps across the Dakota plains in late autumn does not howl. It hisses. It is a low, creeping sound that moves through the dead, brittle prairie grass like a serpent, seeking out the weak, the unsheltered, and the forgotten. For Ilara, holding the trembling hand of 5-year-old Leo, that wind felt like a physical blow. They stood at the edge of the sprawling, empty prairie, looking back at the town that had just spat them out. In the distance, the grand windows of Silas's new Victorian mansion glowed with the warm, arrogant yellow light of expensive kerosene lamps. Smoke billowed from his tall, ornate brick chimneys, fueled by the relentless burning of coal that cost more in a week than Ilara had ever held in her life. In her raw, freezing hand, she clutched the single, crumpled $10 bill Silas had thrown at her. $10. In the society of men, this piece of paper was meant to be her salvation. But as the temperature dropped, Freezing the mud beneath her worn leather boots, the bitter truth of their reality set in. $10 could not buy a month's rent in the poorest boarding house in town. $10 could not buy enough pre-cut timber to build even a rudimentary shack, nor could it purchase a fraction of the coal needed to survive the looming winter. The town's merchants, loyal to Silas's wealth and influence, had made it clear charity was not a currency they accepted. Leo shivered violently, his small chest heaving as the biting cold began to turn his lips a pale, dangerous shade of blue. He did not cry, for the cold was already stealing his energy, but he looked up at his sister with eyes completely devoid of hope. The responsibility of that gaze was a crushing weight. Ilara was not driven by ego, nor by a desire to prove herself to the wealthy men who had discarded them. Her motivation was pure, primal, and entirely selfless. She looked at her brother, and she made a silent, unbreakable vow to the darkening sky. He will not freeze. Not today. Not this winter. She turned away from the mocking lights of the town and looked toward the silent, rolling hills to the north. The elite builders of the town saw the earth merely as a foundation to pour their concrete upon, a dead thing to be conquered and built over with imported pine and glass. But Ilara, remembering the quiet stories her mother had told her of the early pioneers and the native tribes who had lived on this land for millennia, knew better. The earth was not dead. The earth was a massive, silent battery of thermal energy. It was a thick, protective blanket. Leaving Leo nestled in a small grove of protective pine trees, wrapped in her own thin coat, Ilara walked back into the edges of the town. She did not go to the fine lumber yards or the expensive hardware boutiques where Silas bought his polished brass fittings. She went to the scrapyard, a graveyard of discarded iron and forgotten tools on the poor side of the tracks. With her single $10 bill, she made her purchases. She bought a heavy, rusted iron spade with a splintered ashwood handle for $3. For another $2, she bought a heavy iron pickaxe, its head dull but perfectly solid. For $4, she purchased a large, heavy wooden box of thick, reclaimed iron nails and a small, battered hatchet. And with her final $1, she bought a 6-foot section of dented, soot-stained tin stovepipe that a wealthy family had thrown away because it was no longer beautiful enough for their parlor. Exactly $10. She was left penniless, her pockets filled only with the cold air. As she dragged her heavy, rusted treasures through the town square to return to her brother, a cruel twist of fate brought her face to face with her tormentors. Emerging from the warm, fragrant interior of the town's finest bakery were Silas, her wealthy stepfather, and Mr. Thorne, the town's chief architect and engineer. Thorne was a man who worshipped at the altar of modern industry. He wore a pristine wool coat and a tall silk hat, a man who believed that man's intellect had finally defeated nature. They stopped on the wooden boardwalk, looking down at the 16-year-old girl struggling with a rusted shovel and a piece of garbage pipe. Silas chuckled, a dry, rasping sound of pure contempt. "Look at the scavenger," Silas sneered, pulling his fur collar tight against the wind. "I gave you money to take the train out of my town, girl. What is this garbage? Are you digging your own grave to save me the funeral expenses?" Ilara stopped. She did not lower her eyes. "I am building a home for my brother," she said, her voice steady, though her hands shook from the cold. "In the south-facing hill. A dugout." Mr. Thorne, the educated engineer, burst into a loud, theatrical laugh. He looked at Ilara as if she were a foolish, uneducated savage. He pointed a leather-gloved finger at her rusted shovel. "A dirt hole?" Thorne mocked, his voice carrying across the square so the other wealthy townsfolk could hear and join in the amusement. You ignorant child. The frost line in Dakota reaches 3 feet deep. The Earth is a block of ice. Dirt has absolutely no R value, no insulating properties compared to the imported timber I use. You will freeze against the cold clay. He stepped closer, tapping the discarded stovepipe with his silver-tipped cane. And what is this for? A fire in a cave? You know nothing of thermodynamics, girl. A pipe in a damp hole will not draw a draft. The cold air will push the smoke back down. If the freezing mud doesn't kill you, you and that brat will suffocate in your own soot before December is over. My clients spend over $300 on properly ventilated coal boilers for a reason. You cannot cheat physics with $10 of trash. The small crowd that had gathered laughed softly, nodding in agreement with the educated man. They were so utterly convinced of their superiority. They trusted the complicated machines, the expensive coal, and the thin wooden walls of their mansions. They believed that because they had paid a fortune, they were safe. They looked at Alara not with pity, but with the cold, scientific detachment of people watching an insect walk into a fire. Alara absorbed their mockery in total silence. She felt the heavy, biting chill of the wind, and she looked at the thin, fragile glass windows of the buildings around them. She did not argue with Mr. Thorne's science. She knew what he did not. She knew that thermal mass is not about stopping cold, like his fragile wooden walls. It is about absorbing and storing heat. She knew that the Earth, deep down, holds the memory of the summer sun. "Keep your $300 boilers, Mr. Thorne," Alara said softly, her voice carrying a chilling solemnity that briefly silenced the laughing crowd. "When the White Death comes from the north, your paper money will not burn hot enough to save you, and the wood you trust so much will become your tomb." She turned her back on the elites of the town, hoisting the rusted shovel over her shoulder. She walked away from their arrogance, away from their fragile architecture, and headed back into the freezing wilderness to find her brother. The bullying, the humiliation, the scientific scorn of the elites. None of it mattered. The sky was darkening, the temperature was plummeting, and Alara had a mountain to move. She had a $10 dirt hole to dig, and the clock of the great winter was ticking. The wilderness of the Dakota Territory does not negotiate. It does not care about the gold in your pocket, and it certainly does not care about the titles printed on your university degrees. When Alara reached the southern face of a gentle, rolling hill, a mile away from the sneering town, she was not looking at a mound of dead dirt. Guided by the hushed ancestral memories her mother had passed down, stories of the indigenous tribes who had survived these brutal plains for thousands of years, long before the arrogant European architects arrived with their fragile glass and imported timber, Alara saw a fortress. She saw a massive, silent, thermal battery. She set little Leo down on a bed of dry pine needles, wrapping him securely in the heavy wool blanket. The wind was already biting, dropping the surface temperature toward a merciless 10 degrees Fahrenheit. Alara picked up the $3 rusted iron spade. Her hands were already raw, the skin cracked by the freezing air, but her resolve was absolute. She began to dig. The first foot of soil was tough, bound by the dense, fibrous roots of the prairie grass. But as she broke through the topsoil with her $2 iron pickaxe, swinging it with a desperate, rhythmic intensity, she reached the clay. It was heavy, dense, and damp. To the wealthy men in town, this mud was something to be scraped off their expensive leather boots. To Alara, it was the very material of life. For 5 grueling days, while the skies turned a threatening, bruised purple, Alara carved an 8 by 10-foot room directly into the slope of the hill. Her muscles screamed, her palms blistered, bled, and calloused over. But every time she looked at Leo's pale, shivering face, she found the strength to swing the pickaxe again. She was executing a masterpiece of low-tech, passive geothermal engineering, though she had no fancy blueprints to boast of. The physics behind her desperate labor was as ancient as the planet itself. The surface of the Earth is a victim of the sky, freezing in winter and baking in summer. But dig just a few feet down, past the frost line, and the Earth remembers. Millions of tons of deep soil hold a constant, unwavering passive geothermal temperature of around 50 to 55 degrees Fahrenheit, completely immune to the blizzards above. By digging 6 feet deep into the southern face of the hill, Ilara was effectively burying her home inside a giant, natural blanket. The south-facing entrance would catch the low, weak rays of the winter sun, while the thick earth on the north, east, and west would shield them entirely from the cyclonic winds. To roof her dugout, she did not need expensive, imported pine boards. She gathered heavy, fallen cedar branches from the nearby grove, laying them across the top of her excavation. Using her reclaimed iron nails, the $4 investment that Mr. Thorne had mocked, she secured a lattice of smaller branches. Finally, she covered the roof with 2 feet of the thick sod she had carefully cut from the prairie surface. The dense tangle of dirt and roots formed an impenetrable, wind-proof seal. But the true genius of her $10 sanctuary, the very thing that the arrogant engineers of the town fundamentally misunderstood, was the principle of thermal mass and inertia. Back in the town, Mr. Thorne sat in his warm, plush office, drinking expensive amber brandy with Silas. They sat beside a roaring, $300 imported coal boiler. Thorne, leaning back in his leather chair, continued his mockery of the banished girl. "The foolishness of the uneducated," Thorne scoffed to Silas, gesturing to the architectural blueprints of his grand wooden mansions. "Dirt has an R value of a mere 0.25 per inch. Wood has an R value of over 1. That girl's clay walls have no insulation. The moment the temperature drops, the cold earth will suck the life right out of them. And that rusted pipe? Ha! A pipe shoved into a damp hole does not magically generate a draft. The freezing high-pressure air outside will simply push the smoke back down the pipe. They will choke on their own soot in that shallow grave. It is basic fluid dynamics, Silas. You cannot cheat science with $10 of garbage. But Thorne's modern science was blinded by its own hubris. He understood insulation, the slowing of heat loss through light, porous materials like wood. But he had completely forgotten the ancestral science of thermal mass. Wood is light. It stops wind, yes, but it cannot store heat. The moment Mr. Thorne's expensive coal fire goes out, his wooden mansion will freeze in minutes. But the thick, unyielding clay walls of Ilara's dugout weighed thousands of tons. Clay is dense. It is heavy. On the 6th evening, as the first violent flurries of the great blizzard began to spiral from the blackening sky, Ilara brought Leo inside the dugout. She sealed the entrance with a heavy door fashioned from woven branches and packed mud. In the center of the hard-packed floor, she had built a small, simple hearth using smooth river stones. She arranged a handful of dry twigs, buffalo chips, and twisted prairie grass. With a single strike of flint, she birthed a tiny, fragile flame. Now came the test of the $1 discarded stovepipe. Ilara had embedded the dented tin pipe at the back of the dugout, angling it sharply upward through the thick sod roof, exposing the top to the freezing winds above. Mr. Thorne had claimed the cold would push the smoke down, suffocating them. He was wrong. As the tiny fire warmed the air inside the pipe, the fundamental laws of thermodynamics took over. Hot air is lighter than cold air. It desperately wants to rise. As the hot exhaust traveled up the $1 pipe, it hit the violently freezing, fast-moving wind tearing across the top of the hill. This high-speed wind running over the open pipe created a powerful vacuum, the Bernoulli principle in its purest, most primitive application. Instead of pushing smoke down, the blizzard outside literally sucked the smoke up and out of the dugout with immense force. This powerful updraft created a negative pressure inside the small dirt room, which gently pulled fresh, crisp, oxygen-rich air through the microscopic cracks around the mud door. It was a perfect, self-regulating ventilation system. No smoke, no suffocation, just the clean, hypnotic crackle of burning twigs. And then, the magic of thermal inertia began. The tiny fire did not need to roar like the $300 coal beasts in the town. It only needed to burn steadily. As the hours passed, the immense, dense clay walls of the dugout began to absorb the heat. Slowly, deeply, the earth drank the warmth of the fire. The walls became a thermal battery, charging themselves with life-saving energy. Outside, the temperature plummeted to 10 below zero, then 20 below. The wind began to shriek, a terrifying, deafening roar that tore at the fragile wooden mansions of the elites. But 40 feet below the crest of the hill, inside the $10 dirt hole, there was only a profound, womb-like silence. Elara watched as the tense, shivering muscles in little Leo's body finally relaxed. He let out a soft sigh, tossing the heavy wool blanket aside. The air around them was not just warm, it was thick, stable, and deeply comforting. The clay walls, having absorbed the heat, were now radiating it back into the room from every direction. The passive geothermal energy of the deep earth pushed up from below, while the charged thermal mass of the walls wrapped around them like a mother's embrace. Elara looked at a small glass thermometer she had salvaged from the town's trash weeks ago. The thin red line of mercury had climbed steadily and stopped. It did not waver. It did not flicker as the wind outside raged. It held perfectly, beautifully, at exactly 64 degrees Fahrenheit. 64 degrees, built with $10, a rusted shovel, and the forgotten wisdom of the earth. Elara pulled Leo into her lap, resting her back against the warm, solid clay wall. She closed her eyes, listening to the muffled, distant howling of the storm above. The elites had laughed. They had mocked her poverty, her tools, and her intellect. But as the great white hurricane finally slammed into the Dakota plains with apocalyptic fury, the time for arrogance was over. The pendulum was about to swing, and the fragile $300 illusions of the wealthy were about to be shattered by the absolute, unyielding power of nature. The great white hurricane did not arrive with a warning. It did not gradually announce its presence with gentle flurries. It descended upon the Dakota plains like a solid wall of white concrete moving at 70 miles per hour. It was a cyclonic bomb of unprecedented fury, a collision of atmospheric pressures that violently ripped the sky apart. In a matter of minutes, the temperature in the town of arrogant men plummeted 50 degrees, crashing down to a lethal, suffocating 40 degrees below zero. The air itself weaponized. Billions of microscopic ice crystals, driven by the shrieking wind, sandblasted the beautiful, expensive paint off the Victorian mansions, seeking any weakness, any crack, any flaw in the prideful architecture of the wealthy. Inside the grand parlor of his brand-new mansion, Silas's face had lost all its cruel, confident color. He and Mr. Thorne, the educated chief engineer, were huddled mere inches from the roaring, $300 imported cast-iron boiler. They were shoveling expensive black coal into its fiery maw as fast as their trembling, blistered hands could move. But the physics of their modern arrogance had profoundly betrayed them. Mr. Thorne had boasted of the R-value of his imported pine, but he had entirely forgotten the ancient law of thermal mass. Wood is light. It is porous. It cannot store heat. It can only briefly delay its escape. As the cyclonic wind battered the exterior walls, it created a massive pressure differential, a merciless vacuum that violently sucked the heat right through the microscopic pores of the timber and the elegant gaps in the expensive window frames. Convective heat loss was stripping the mansion bare. They were burning a fortune in coal, yet the heat was vanishing into the howling void almost instantly. 40 feet below the crest of the hill, the apocalyptic roar of the cyclonic bomb was reduced to a low, distant hum, like the breathing of a sleeping giant. Inside the $10 dirt hole, the air was heavy, still, and bathed in a soft, golden light. Ilara sat comfortably on the hard-packed clay floor, her shoulders relaxed, her raw hands finally resting in her lap. The salvaged glass thermometer she had hung on a thick root remained stubbornly, beautifully frozen at exactly 64 degrees Fahrenheit. It did not waver. Little Leo slept flat on his back, having pushed his heavy wool blanket down to his waist. His chest rose and fell in a slow, peaceful rhythm, a soft, contented sigh escaping his lips. Back in the town, the psychological collapse of the elite was accelerating with every drop in the thermometer. The iron boiler in Silas's parlor was glowing a dull, terrifying cherry red, consuming fuel at a desperate, unsustainable rate. Yet, the air in the center of the grand room was plunging below freezing. Thorne, the man who had mocked the ignorant child, watched in wide-eyed, shivering horror as the water inside a heavy crystal pitcher on the dining table began to turn cloudy. He watched, paralyzed by the failure of his own intellect, as the water crystallized and finally cracked the expensive glass with a sharp, violent snap. The water had frozen solid right in front of a raging fire. The freezing cold was now radiating from the interior walls themselves. Their towering wooden mansion was no longer a shelter. It had become a beautifully decorated, inescapable freezer. Silas clutched a fistful of paper money in his coat pocket, his teeth chattering uncontrollably as a sudden crushing realization washed over his soul. He could pile all the cash he owned into the belly of that iron beast, and it would not buy him an extra hour of life. His wealth was a complete illusion. He could not bribe the wind. He could not foreclose on the winter. Deep inside the earth, Ilara did not need to frantically shovel coal to fight the storm. She was not fighting nature. She had surrendered to its wisdom. Every 2 hours, she calmly, deliberately, placed a single, dry cedar branch onto her small hearth. The immense, dense clay walls of her dugout, heavy with the absorbed heat of the past few days, were performing a miracle of thermal inertia. The earth was acting as a massive, silent, indestructible battery. The colder and faster the wind blew across the top of the hill, the stronger the Bernoulli vacuum effect over her $1 stovepipe became. The fierce blizzard outside was effortlessly pulling the thin trail of smoke up and out, while drawing clean, oxygen-rich air through the porous soil of the entrance. The dugout was breathing. It was alive. The thick mud, which Thorne had called a shallow grave, was continuously wrapping the banished siblings in a warm, unbreakable embrace. The $10 dirt hole was defeating the $300 engineering marvel through sheer, humble physics. As midnight approached, the storm's fury reached a terrifying crescendo. In the town, the sounds of structural failure began to echo through the frozen streets. Thick pine beams snapped under the sheer weight of the snow. Expensive glass windows shattered inward, instantly burying velvet couches in drifts of deadly white powder. Silas and Thorne retreated into a small interior closet, wrapping themselves in layers of frozen Persian rugs, their lungs burning with every breath of sub-zero air. The great men of the town, the masters of commerce and industry, were reduced to whimpering, terrified animals, praying to a sky they had spent their lives trying to conquer. Their arrogance had literally frozen over. And just a mile away, under millions of pounds of ancient insulating soil, Ilara stroked her brother's warm hair. She listened to the muffled, distant symphony of the wind, feeling the profound, radiant heat of the 64-degree clay against her back. She had no money, no title, and no power. But she had the earth, and as the experts froze in their monuments of hubris, the banished 16-year-old girl held the absolute, undisputed mastery of survival. When dawn finally broke over the Dakota Plains, it did not bring the warm, forgiving light of the sun. It brought a pale, bruised, and terrifying gray that illuminated a landscape entirely wiped clean of human vanity. The great white hurricane had moved on, but it had left behind a frozen graveyard of modern arrogance. The wind had died down to a sharp, slicing breeze, but the temperature remained paralyzed at a deadly 35 degrees below zero. In the center of the town, the grand, imported wooden mansions stood like silent, glittering tombs. Their expensive glass windows were frosted completely opaque from the inside out. Inside Silas's towering Victorian home, the $300 coal boiler had finally choked and died, its iron belly cracked by the sheer, violent contrast between the burning coal and the absolute zero of the ambient air. The wood had offered no thermal mass. It had surrendered all its heat to the storm hours ago. Silas, the wealthy merchant, and Mr. Thorne, the proud chief engineer, were no longer masters of their domain. They were reduced to trembling, freezing husks of men. Their expensive wool coats and imported furs were stiff with their own frozen breath. Their lips were a terrifying, necrotic blue, and they could no longer feel their hands or feet. Death was not knocking at their heavy oak door. It was already sitting in their parlor. Through the haze of hypothermia, a desperate, humiliating realization pierced Silas's mind. His money was worthless. Thorne's engineering degrees were useless. Their grand house was killing them. There was only one place in the entire valley that might still harbor life, a place they had mocked, a place they had called a shallow grave. Driven by the primal, animal terror of freezing to death, the two men abandoned their $300 frozen monument. They stumbled out into the knee-deep snow, fighting through the drifts, their lungs burning as if inhaling crushed glass. They fell, crawled, and dragged themselves toward the southern hills. Every step was a punishment for their hubris. The elite men of the town were crawling on their bellies through the frozen mud, begging the earth for a mercy they had never shown to others. When they finally reached the base of the hill, they saw nothing but a massive, smooth snowdrift. But then, Thorne's frozen, weeping eyes caught a faint, almost imperceptible distortion in the air. Protruding from the top of the snow-covered mound was the $1 rusted tin stovepipe. The snow around it was completely melted. A thin, steady, beautiful ribbon of gray smoke was rising into the freezing air, drawn up by the perfect, self-sustaining vacuum of the Bernoulli effect. Down below, the fire was still breathing. Silas dragged himself up the slope to the spot where the entrance should be. He didn't use his silver-tipped cane. He used his bare, bleeding hands to claw frantically at the frozen snow until he revealed the heavy door of woven branches and packed mud. He did not pound on it with the authority of a wealthy landlord. He collapsed against it, his pride entirely shattered. "Ilara," Silas gasped, his voice a pathetic, broken wheeze. "Please, please open the door. We are dying." Inside the dugout, the silence was absolute, save for the soft crackle of the cedar fire and the gentle breathing of little Leo, who was sitting on the hard-packed clay floor, playing with a smooth river stone. The salvaged glass thermometer still held its unwavering, triumphant line at exactly 64 degrees Fahrenheit. Ilara heard the scratching at her door. She heard the whimpering of the men who had banished her to die. A lesser soul, poisoned by ego, would have let them freeze. A vindictive heart would have demanded an apology, or demanded Silas's fortune in exchange for entry. But Ilara was not an elite. She was a guardian of life, carrying the quiet, absolute nobility of the earth itself. She stood up, walked to the door, and pulled back the heavy wooden latch. As the door swung open, the physical contrast between the two worlds collided. A thick, heavy wave of 64-degree air rolled out of the dirt hole and hit the two freezing men like a physical blow. To Silas and Thorn, it smelled of dry cedar, warm clay, and pure, miraculous life. Ilara stood in the doorway, her humble, worn clothes bathed in the golden light of the fire. She looked down at the wealthy merchant and the educated engineer, who were now sobbing on their hands and knees in the snow. She did not smile. She did not boast. "Come inside," she said softly. "The earth has enough warmth for you, too." Silas and Thorn crawled over the threshold, collapsing onto the dirt floor. As Ilara pulled the heavy door shut behind them, sealing out the 35 below zero nightmare, Thorn lay on his back, staring up at the ceiling of sod and branches. He felt the immense, heavy, radiant heat pouring out of the dense clay walls. His $300 boiler had failed, but this $10 dirt hole had captured the very heartbeat of the planet. He reached out a trembling, frost-bitten hand and pressed it flat against the mud wall. It was warm. The thermal mass had absorbed the fire's energy and was now saving the life of the man who had mocked it. Thorn closed his eyes. Tears of absolute humiliation and profound gratitude streaming down his face. He had been a fool. The 16-year-old girl with a rusted shovel understood the physics of survival better than the finest universities in the world. Silas, shivering violently as the lifeblood slowly returned to his veins, looked across the tiny room. He saw 5-year-old Leo, warm, healthy, and perfectly safe, looking back at him with innocent eyes. Silas lowered his head, his expensive silk hat crushed in the dirt, entirely broken by the sublime mercy of the girl he had discarded. The storm had passed, and the hierarchy of the world had been permanently rewritten. The illusion of paper money and arrogant architecture had been stripped away by the harsh truth of winter. The elites had learned that true wealth is not stored in banks, nor is it built with imported timber. True wealth is the ancient, humble knowledge of how to live in harmony with the planet. It is the understanding that the earth is not a dead thing to be conquered, but a mother who will protect those who respect her laws. Ilara's $10 dirt hole stood as a silent, eternal monument to this truth, a legacy of resistance, warmth, and the unbreakable power of humility. We have reached the end of this journey, but the fire of this knowledge must not be allowed to go out. If you believe that the humble wisdom of our ancestors holds more value than the arrogant, fragile illusions of modern wealth, I invite you to join our community. Subscribe to the channel and become a guardian of this forgotten knowledge. Leave a like to honor Ilara's resilience and the undeniable power of the earth. Share this video with those who need to remember that true security cannot be bought. It must be built with patience, respect, and a willingness to learn from nature. And before you go, leave a comment below. From which city are you watching today? Let us see how far this manifesto of cultural resistance has traveled. Until the next storm, keep your fires burning, respect the earth beneath your feet, and never let the arrogance of the world extinguish your humanity.